Namaste Girim Jatkripatamaham Vande Aranim Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupakadamahyam Virati Swapadantikam Mancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhobhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. So I'm happy again to be here among you all. And we're here to continue our discussion of what I have characterized as the reach of a powerful force. Just trying to understand just how great Bhakti is. And so last week, this week, I'm calling this week a little more digging. I couldn't come up with a great title. But this seems to reflect what happened after I read Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's Tika, his commentary on verse 19th of the 5th chapter of the Bhagavatam's first canto. Navaijano jatu katanshana virajin, mukunda sevyan vayadanga samshatim, smaran mukundangri upaguhanam punar vihatumichen narasagraho jana. My dear Vyas, even though a devotee of Lord Krishna sometimes falls down somehow or other, he certainly does not undergo material existence like others, the fruitive workers, etc. Because a person who has once relished the taste of the lotus feet of the Lord can do nothing but remember that ecstasy again and again. And last week I shared with you Srila Prabhupada's, I think I've always thought it's quite a wonderful and generous purport explaining the position of a bhakta, of a devotee, even one who strays or falls from the path of bhakti, because as Srila Prabhupada puts it in his purport, of bad association, or as Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur puts it in his Tika, poor determination. And the two things go hand in hand. So it's not a great mystery. So then I also shared Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentary. And how when I read his commentary of this verse, it just opened the verse, opened up a whole new realm for me and my understanding of Krishna Bhakti. Then I started chasing things down. So I'm going to review that as well. Excuse me. Still very early in the morning here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So I want to go over Bhanu Swami's translation of this verse, as well as his translation of the last part of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentary. So Bhanu Swami translates it, "Oh, the person who serves Mukunda will never under any condition return to the material world, unlike practitioners of other processes. Remembering the embrace of the Lord's lotus feet, eager for that taste he has experienced, he will not desire to give up those feet again." And then in the last paragraph of his commentary, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur writes, "This verse also uses the phrase does not desire to give up instead of does not give up. This implies that he desires that he be devoid of pride in his practice. The accomplishment is in the hands of the Lord. The cause of not desiring to give up is then mentioned. Rasagraha means one who is eager for tasting, or one who has a taste which is something like a ghost which cannot be given up, haunted by rasa. And when I read that phrase, I don't know, my mind kind of imploded, haunted by rasa. And so, you know, it's the implication is that this is something. It's like a ghost which you can't shake, and that's actually the literal translation of haunted. Of rasagraha. Graha means haunted, as by a ghost. And then this next sentence I've always taken as a sort of maybe a sangshaya, a bit of a doubt, rather than the kind of straightforward reading that we see here. The meaning is then that worship after stages of nishta, ruchi, and asakti becomes actual rasa at the stage of rati. So the way I read this is, because of the way he responds to it, is as him kind of posing a doubt. And this is something Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur does. He's really good about really examining something very carefully by posing a doubt, or even a purvapaksha, even a counter argument, so that he can unfold what he wants to say more fully. So the way I read this sentence is, we may suppose then that the meaning is that worship after the stages of nishta, ruchi, and asakti becomes actual rasa at the stage of rati, stage of bhava. And the reason I read it like that is because then he says, however, from the first day of worshiping the Lord, there is certainly a portion of tasting rasa in a very covered form. Thus it is said, Bhakti pareshano bhavo viraktiranyatra chaishatrika ekakala prapadyamanasya anyatash natahastus tushti pushtikshurapayo nabhasan. Devotion, direct experience of the Supreme Lord, and detachment from other things. These three occur simultaneously for one who has taken shelter of the Lord, taken shelter of Krishna, in the same way that pleasure, excuse me, fullness of the stomach, and relief from hunger are experienced simultaneously with each bite for a person engaged in eating. So, in order to support his assertion that even at the very, even before the more advanced stages of nishta, ruchi, and asakti, there still is some rasa, because rasagraha means, oh, you've actually tasted some rasa. But what is that rasa? It's the rasa of having served the Lord's lotus feet. Bhanu Swami translates it as the embrace of the Lord's lotus feet. Srila Prabhupada says the taste of the lotus feet. So it seems to me that what they're talking about is the taste of having served the Lord's lotus feet. So he supports that with this verse from the second chapter of the 11th canto. So this is, I was just commenting last night in an online Nectar of Devotion class that I need to make a chart for myself of which of the Navayogendras speaks which verses in those first few chapters of the 11th canto to King Nimi. And I haven't done that yet. And so I'm not able to remember which of those 9 sages actually spoke this verse. So then I thought, okay, that's intriguing. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur certainly seems to have a zeal for the power of bhakti. He's seems really invested in singing the praises of bhakti and Bhakti Devi and her power. So then the next thing I thought was, of course, I've got to go look and see what Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur wrote in his commentary on this verse. So this is what we find. Same verse. Devotion, direct experience of the Supreme Lord, and detachment from other things. These three occur simultaneously for one who has taken shelter of Krishna, in the same way that pleasure, fullness of the stomach, and relief from hunger are experienced simultaneously with each bite for a person engaged in eating. So this is a very striking analogy and very apt. Because not only do the three things happen simultaneously, but they happen progressively as we eat, as we'll see in Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentary on this verse. So this is his entire tika on this verse. An example is given to show that even at the stage of sadhana, which gives great happiness, one achieves the result. I mean, that's big right there. That is just, it seems to me that's about as clear as you can get. Even at the stage of sadhana, which gives great happiness, one achieves the result. So then he says, where there is bhakti in the form of hearing and chanting about Krishna, the supreme deity, there should be a sweet experience. So we all have some experience of bhakti, some sweet experience. Either in a good kirtan, hearing a really good discourse on the Bhagavatam, or reading some verses that might even trigger an epiphany, where we see something that we hadn't seen before. I mean, I remember when I first started associating with the devotees fairly systematically. So this was end of 1969, beginning of 1970. I started reading Bhagavad Gita as it is, and I started, of course, with Srila Prabhupada's introduction, which is pretty lengthy. And one thing he says in the introduction that really caught my attention, because I had tried to read several editions of Bhagavad Gita before. I was very invested in understanding Bhagavad Gita since I was a teenager, and I just was never able to get into it, never able to figure it out. And so probably while I was in the Navy, and maybe just after I got out of the Navy, that was in 1969, I had read, because at the time I was really into Gandhi. I really got into like nonviolent resistance. I mean, I was part of managing the keeping track of what was going on with the war in Vietnam. I was an intelligence analyst, and what I saw really disturbed me. So I kind of, in my heart, went in the opposite direction. So, and Gandhi was really into the Bhagavad Gita, at least his own understanding, which he shares in a book. But and that didn't really work for me either. And so I was kind of disappointed that this text I really wanted to understand just didn't even seem accessible to me. And when I met the devotees and I got a copy of Bhagavad Gita as it is, even before I bought one, I was thumbing through the pages, and this devotee who showed it to me, who's now a very dear friend of mine, Turiya Das, handed me the Gita, asked me if I'd ever read that edition. And I said, oh no, I hadn't seen it. So I started thumbing through, and I picked a couple pages at random here and there. And I remember looking up at him, and I just read just random stuff. And it just resonated with me, it clicked. And I remember looking at Turiya Das and saying, I don't understand how, but this makes more sense to me than anything I've ever read. And he just smiled. And this is the power of Bhakti. So that was a bit of an epiphany. And then when I moved into the temple, I guess at the beginning of 1970, I was reading the Srimad Bhagavatam, and as I was reading the second verse of the Bhagavatam, so this was pretty early in my, quite soon after I'd moved into the temple, I read the second verse of the Bhagavatam, which talks about, among other things, who's a fit audience for the Bhagavatam. It's kind of a thesis statement. It's the Vastu Nirdesha Shloka of Srimad Bhagavatam. So it tells us what the subject matter is, what the point is that the Bhagavatam is going to make. But in the course of doing that, it also tells us who is the best audience. Dharma prodchita kaitavotra paramo nirmatsaranam satam. Right in the first line, in the first pada of that verse, it tells us that those who can actually appreciate this particular text are those who have already done what Krishna says to do at the end of the Bhagavad Gita. Sarva dharman parityajya mamekam sharanam vraja. Completely reject all conventional forms of dharma. So the Bhagavatam's language is even a little starker. It calls them kaitava dharma. And as I've mentioned many times before, I hope not too many times, when Krishnadas Kaviraj discusses the second verse of the Bhagavatam in the 22nd chapter of Madhya-lila of Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, he says, what do we mean by kaitava dharma? Dharma praujjita. Praujjita means the same thing as parityaja, completely reject, but it's in the past, from what I understand. So for those who've already given up all kinds of kaitava dharma, and Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami says, what do we mean by kaitava dharma? Well, that means dharma, artha, kama, moksha, vancha. That means aspiring for the fruits of having become a virtuous person, making spiritual progress, enjoying life as you can when you make material progress, making material progress, artha, the kind of pleasure that you can get when you become materially successful, and then the desire for liberation when you realize that it was all a scam. So this is, so when I read that verse, I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then as I read through Srila Prabhupada's purport, I came across a sentence where he makes a very strong distinction between the devotees, those who are nirmatsaranam. They're completely free from envy, because they don't have anything to gain in the material world. So Srila Prabhupada says that everybody's competing with each other for the resources of material nature, humans against humans, animals against animals. He says, but the transcendental devotees of the Lord, they're not competing with anyone for these things, because they've come to create a competition-less society with God at the center. And when I read that sentence, that was it. I knew at that moment that I had found the revolution that we had all been looking for. And I also knew I just wasn't going anywhere. So this verse, when I read this verse, I also see not only are the devotion. I was talking about that sense of devotion. So a good kirtan, a good Bhagavatam verse, or a good talk on the Bhagavad Gita or something like that, those things that give us this kind of happiness, that's that experience of bhakti. And then he says, when there is bhakti in the form of hearing and chanting about Krishna, the Supreme Deity, there should be a sweet experience. At that time, there should also be an experience of detachment from material happiness. These three should arise at the same time for the person who worships Krishna. However, as we'll see with the analogy of eating a meal, they appear simultaneously and also progressively. So let's take a look at that analogy. Similarly, for when a person eats, there is happiness, nourishment, and disappearance of hunger with each mouthful. As one takes a mouthful of rice, this happens. Just as the person who eats a little gets a little satisfaction, a little nourishment, fullness of stomach, and a little relief from hunger, so a person who worships the Lord a little with hearing and chanting gets a little experience of the Lord, a little detachment from material life. And just as a person who eats a lot gets full satisfaction, full nourishment, and full relief from hunger, so a person who worships the Lord fully experiences the Lord fully and becomes completely detached from material life. But though it is impossible to keep eating, although that this may not be quite so evident when you're 22 as it is when you're in your mid-70s, though it is impossible to keep eating, by more worship of the Lord, one becomes more capable of worshiping. That is the difference. So we know that any analogy in the world is imperfect. And so here he points out the flaw in this analogy. We can't keep eating unlimitedly, but by practicing our worship of the Lord, it enables us, spurs us to and enables us to worship more and more. So this seems to me it's a progressive thing, and it begins, the pleasure that we get from eating a meal begins with that first mouthful of rice. There's some pleasure there. The nourishment begins there as well with that first morsel of rice. And the slaking of hunger, the relief from hunger also begins right then with that first mouthful of rice. And they become progressively, we become progressively pleased, satisfied, and relieved of hunger the more we eat, until we know it's time to stop. So it's the same, it seems to me, with practicing our sadhana. We get some experience of the Lord through our hearing and chanting. Something happens that draws us to take more carefully to the association of devotees, to take more assiduously, more devotedly the practice of sadhana bhakti. So that's some experience of the Lord. Just whatever that practice is, and we feel a little detachment at the beginning, and we become progressively detached from everything other than bhakti the more we practice, and the more carefully we practice. There's I don't know if I've had an occasion to share this anecdote that I like to share about practice. There's a story I've read in a few places about Pablo Casals. Pablo Casals was a cellist. He was probably the most prominent. He was considered by the consensus was that he was pretty much the best cellist of the 20th century. I guess he was kind of succeeded by Yo-Yo Ma, who's probably now the most famous cellist in the world. Maestro Casals, I think he was from Spain and lived in Puerto Rico, I think, in his old age. So he was being interviewed in his he was in his 90s by a young reporter, and he mentioned along the way that he practiced several hours a day, every day, and when he said practice, that doesn't mean sitting down just playing things for pleasure. He said that includes running scales and doing exercises and things like that. And it was something like 4, 5, 6 hours a day that he would practice, as I remember it. And the reporter asked him, why? Because at this time, he was in his 90s, his performing career was way behind him. And he still, this is what he did every day. So she asked him, well, Maestro, why is it that you practice so much every day? And he just shrugged and he said, I think I'm making progress. So anyway, I always took this as a really nice lesson. I used to share it with my university and college writing students. I would tell them that writing is a skill. And like any skill, we improve with practice. Now, different people bring maybe different levels of innate talent, perhaps from a previous lifetime or something, to that particular skill. But they sharpen it by constant practice. And so I would, give some example, like from music, from popular music, well, at least popular music of my day. And it probably wasn't so much in the rear view mirror when I was teaching. Like Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix, Mark Knopfler, Stevie Ray Vaughan, whoever who you think is the best guitarist, B.B. King. These people, they brought a lot of musical talent with them, and perhaps an innate understanding of the guitar. But I'll bet you that they also sat down and noodled around with their guitar every chance they got. Or like, oh gosh, giving away my age here. I think the example I probably used for athletics was Michael Jordan, who obviously brought some innate talent to basketball. But whenever he had a chance, when he was a kid and a young man, he would go play pickup basketball. Like on playground courts or something like that. I mean, he was just always playing, always working on his skills. And then I would ask the students, who here took music lessons when they were young? Hands would go up and I'd ask them which instruments they played. And then I would ask them, then how often did you practice? And the response was always unanimous, every day, half hour or an hour or more. And so it's the same thing with our bhakti. If we practice, we make this kind of progress that we see here in this verse. So I thought, okay, that is really interesting. I wonder if there's more. And then I came across something in the 14th chapter of the 11th canto. So this is in the Uddhava Gita. The chapter begins with Uddhava asking his friend Krishna, what is the best practice for human beings? So just like if we go back and look at the verse from the 5th chapter of the 1st canto, it's quite appropriate that this is a verse glorifying bhakti over everything else. So we looked at it last week, I think, together with the 17th chapter. And so that the two verses together draw a very stark contrast between bhakti and every other practice, including other spiritual practices. So I thought, okay. So I went looking around and I found this, I found 3 verses in the 14th chapter of the 11th canto that actually in his comments on which Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur directly addresses this. So the first one is text 18. Madhyamanopi madbhakto vishaya ajitendriya thaya pragalbaya bhaktya vishaya nabhibhuyate. My dear Uddhava, if my devotee has not fully conquered his senses, he may be harassed by material desires, but because of his unflinching devotion to me, he will not be defeated by sense gratification. So this is an interesting verse. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur has this to say about it. He said, putting aside the topic of the devotee who has developed bhava, the devotee at the beginning of bhakti is also successful. So here he echoes what he wrote in that Tika on the second chapter, that 42nd verse of the second chapter. Because of his unflinching devotion for me, he will not be defeated by sense gratification. So even if the devotee isn't completely pure, even if the devotee is not terribly advanced, his or her success in their practice of bhakti is assured. This is a very strong statement. He will not be defeated by sense gratification. So there may be some difficulties, but eventually, in the long run, it's not going to push that devotee down. By bhakti, which is generally strong, what to speak of bhakti, which is very strong, the devotee cannot be overcome by material enjoyment. The words also suggest the following: just as a jnani who commits a sinful act will be criticized, his position as a jnani will be denied. And then there's a verse from the 19th chapter of the 11th canto. One who has not controlled the 6 forms of illusion, lust, anger, greed, excitement, false pride, and intoxication, whose intelligence, the leader of the senses, is extremely attached, to material things, who is bereft of knowledge and detachment, who adopts the sannyas order of life to make a living, who denies the worshipable demigods, his own self and the Supreme Lord within himself, thus ruining all religious principles, and who is still infected by material contamination, is deviated and lost, both in this life and the next. As we say in Hawaiian, awe. Oh my goodness, this is such a strong statement. And here is what Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says in his commentary. But the devotee who commits sin is not criticized, and his position as a devotee is not denied. This is true of the jnani, this be true of the yogi. But it's not true of the devotee. And then to support this, he cites Bhagavad Gita chapter 9, text 30, with which most of us are probably pretty familiar. Api chetsu duracharo ojate mam ananyapa sadhureva samantavya samyag vyavasito, he said. Even if the most sinful person worships me with no desire other than to please me, I consider that person to be my devotee, as he has fixed himself completely in me. So this is Bhanu Swami's translation of this verse. Srila Prabhupada's is, a little less explicit, but he says, what he says is still quite strong, that he must be considered saintly because he has fixed himself completely in me. So this Ananya Bhakti that's discussed in this verse, Ananya Bhak, this means that there's only one object of worship, and that's Krishna. And even you have to do karma yoga perfectly to get the results. You have to do Ashtanga yoga perfectly to get the results. You have to do Jnana yoga perfectly to get the results. Bhakti yoga, the results are assured, even if you blow it. There's another verse in the 11th canto where it says, there's no danger for a devotee, even if they may run wildly with their eyes closed. Still, there's no danger that they'll be actually deviated from the path. So Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, though the devotee is distressed by sense objects, he's not overcome. Because both verbs are in the present tense, it implies that even while being harassed by sense objects, he is not really harassed, since bhakti is present. A person who is attacked by the weapons of an enemy cannot be defeated because of the presence of his bravery. Or, on the day that a powerful medicine is taken to prevent fever, excuse me, though the fever still causes suffering, it is not a real cause of suffering, since the fever is in a state of being destroyed and will be completely destroyed the next day. And then there's verse 19. Krishna says, my dear Uddhava, just as a blazing fire turns firewood into ashes, similarly, devotion to me completely burns to ashes sins committed by my devotees. Oh, excuse me, okay. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, Bhakti destroys the sins committed by the devotee who cannot control his senses. So, if we think that, somehow or other we're overcoming our sins, that's not the case. If we look at Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the very beginning of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, we see that it's Bhakti that gives us relief from material distress by destroying the reactions to any past activities, good or bad. It's Bhakti that makes everything auspicious for us. It's Bhakti that makes liberation seem insignificant, etc. So it's Bhakti that destroys the sins of those devotees who cannot control their senses. I mean, the devotees generally, we try to control our senses, but we often find it difficult. We often find ourselves drawn by sense objects to which we may be habituated. We may even find ourselves drawn to new experiences. All the same, we can't be really knocked off the path. So then he says, Vishwanath says, an example is given. Addressing Uddhava, he implies that Uddhava should be joyful. Uddhava means joyful on hearing this. And then there's verse 26. Excuse me. Which says, Yata yatatma parimrjyate sao punya gata shravanadi bharana tata pashyati vastu shukshman chakshur yataya vanjana samprayuktam. When a diseased eye is treated with a medicinal ointment, it gradually recovers its power to see. Similarly, as a conscious living entity cleanses himself of material contamination by hearing and chanting the pious narrations of my glories, he regains his ability to see me, the absolute truth, in my subtle spiritual form. So Krishna's, the spiritual form of every entity is very shukshma, subtle, very difficult to discern. They're adhokshaja, actually, beyond the reach of the mind and the senses. So then Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, and here we go, starting with the first service. So this takes us back to 1519, from the first day of worshiping. Starting with the first service, in proportion to the purification of the Atma by pure bhakti, and in proportion to the hearing, chanting, and remembering, one attains various degrees of realization of my sweetness. In proportion to hearing and chanting my glories, one sees the real nature, the vastu, of my form and pastimes with an experience of sweetness, shukshmam. Vastu shukshmam is a dvandva compound expressed in the singular number, or it can mean subtle truth with the modifier placed after the noun, or here's an editing error, placed after the noun as poetic license. One eye is better than being blind. Better than that is having both eyes. Better than that is having the eyes anointed with a special ointment so that one sees higher objects, finer objects. Whoops. Okay. Bring that back because I'm going to take a look at some of those again. So when I read this, I found myself very heartened. I thought, okay, it seems like I'm really on to something. If at least, if nothing else, it's clear that Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, if nothing else, is a very dedicated believer in the power of bhakti over everything else. And so I thought, wow, this is really great. So, you know, we see how all these different commentaries kind of work together to make this case. If we go back, oops. If we go back to his commentary on 1519, he says, you know, the meaning is that worship after, he says, however, from the very first day of worshiping the Lord, there's certainly a portion of tasting rasa in a very covered form. So if we were to read rasa graha as he suggests in what I take as the expression of a doubt, then we can dismiss that doubt, that we're not just talking about ruchi, asakti, or bhava, that we're actually clearly talking about sadhana bhakti from its very beginning of earliest stages of shraddha, sadhu sangha, and even anishtita bhajana kriya, unsteady devotional practice. And then, when Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur is talking about, I think it's the 18th verse, yeah, the 18th verse in the 14th chapter of the 11th canto, he cites this famous verse, Api chet suduracharo bhajate mama nanyapak sadhureva samantavya samyag vyavasito hisaha. Even if somebody who's completely devoted to me without, you know, having any faith in the other devatas or any other process, so-called spiritual processes, and certainly without faith in material progress, even if they do the most horrible things, even if they completely blow it, he says, that we must still consider them saintly. And I remember reading years ago Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's tika on this verse, and here he kind of poses a little dialogue with doubts. And he says, so wait, why must he be considered saintly? And he has Krishna responding, because I see him as saintly. That's what we see here in this translation of verse 30. And so often this verse is used as a kind of a club against devotees whose practice may be imperfect or may even seem to deviate in some way. And other devotees will use it to as a club to point out faults in them, and then say, yeah, I know what you're going to say, Bhagavad Gita 9:30, but Prabhupada says this isn't an excuse. And the fact is, if we actually read the verse, especially if we read it in the context of the chapter, which it is, which it's almost at the very end of, the most confidential knowledge. I mean, Krishna starts out by saying, I am going to tell you the most confidential knowledge, and you're going to have to buckle your seatbelt, because this is going to become a very exciting ride. So here he gets to so this is very confidential stuff here. And so he says, even if the most sinful person worships me with no other desire than to please me, I consider him my devotee, even if he does something terrible. So this is not a verse that's given to excuse poor behavior on the part of a devotee, especially if we look at it in the context of the 9th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the most confidential knowledge. This is a glorification of bhakti, pure and simple. That bhakti is more powerful than our, as we see in the 11th canto, than our attraction for sense gratification. Bhakti is more powerful than our most sinful desires. And eventually we become successful. So I took great heart in reading these commentaries, these verses and commentaries all together. But then there arose in me a doubt, which we will explore, that doubt and its resolution, which we'll explore next week. And I'll stop here. Whoops, how do I, oh, I guess I'll stop sharing. And I'll stop here to entertain any questions or any discussion. So I guess Sakyarati can unmute and Shanaman can unmute, give everybody permission to unmute themselves, I guess. And we'll see what comes up. Oh, I guess.
Maharaj.
Sakyarati says, thank you, you're welcome. Yes, Prabhu.
I was wondering if Bhagavad Gita 239 could fit into the as a supporting verse here.
Oh, see, this is such a I become more grateful to Padmanabha Maharaj every day for asking me to do this, because now I'm getting more material. Someone suggested something last week, and now we've got Bhagavad Gita 239, which we can take a quick look at. I've got Bhagavad Gita as it is here. Let me grab my Guru Maharaj's.
I'm talking about Nehabhikramana Shosti. I'm not
Yeah.
sure. Okay.
Oh, 239. Oh, okay. Yeah. Oh, I think that's what also came up last week as well. That's 40. Nehabhikramana Shosti Pratyavaya Navidyate. That in the practice, that nothing's wasted, and the our progress in bhakti is never diminished. Even the slightest practice of this discipline protects us from the greatest danger. Gosh, I hope I can find the note I made last week as well, but I think this was the same verse that might have come up. And in my notes, in my annotations in the book, at the end of his commentary, Swami Tripurari writes, this is discussed further in the 31st verse of chapter 9, because just as we see in the discussion in one of Vishwanath's commentaries about, if you take medicine for a fever, you still may have the fever the day you take the medicine, but the fever is already being destroyed, and the next day the fever will be gone. So in the 31st verse, Krishna tells Arjuna, this is because we still have to consider this person saintly. I consider this person my devotee in Bhanu Swami's translation, and that's because bhakti is so powerful that it will, that it actually has the power to consume the reactions to even the most sinful activities. So yeah, this is gold. Thank you. Oh, I think it was something from the 6th chapter that we were looking at last week. I'm going to have to.
Yes,
And
yes.
that and that opened up to me actually several verses in the 6th chapter. So I'm gathering even more evidence by consulting with my friends. So I thank you all very much for that. Is there anything else? I know I can always count on Shamananda. Annapurna says thank you. And you're very welcome. I want to thank everybody for the opportunity, Padmanabha Maharaj especially, but all of you who actually come, so I'm not just talking to Mr. Zoom, which may be more comfortable for me. But I find that actually, as Guru Maharaj has often pointed out, half the work is done by the audience. If there's anything valuable here, you get at least half the credit because of the inspiration that the speakers get from the devotees. Also, Mahapriya also thanked me in the chat, so I want to acknowledge that as well. And Bhakti Lata.
I think Annapurna. Hi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm looking at it. And I think I see what she's saying. And Srila Prabhupada makes it really clear. There's a difference between making mistakes and learning from them, and deliberately deviating, and and persisting in maybe, I guess, putting yourself forth as a great sadhu on the plea, on the what do you call it, the authority of this verse. Srila Prabhupada in his purport. Let me find that. Well, let me see what Guru Maharaj has to say first here. Guru Maharaj is 6. So, he says, even, he says, Krishna here says that the sinner, suduracha, and it's just not duracha, it's suduracha, really, really bad stuff. You have even really bad character. Because of their surrender to serving Krishna, they're to be considered saintly. And he says, understandably, these verses have been explained in numerous ways to qualify what Krishna is saying, so that one cannot cite them to support bad character in the name of bhakti. However, in evoking these explanations, one must be careful not to undermine the power of bhakti, which is the spirit of the text. Srila Prabhupada writes, Srila Prabhupada is quite explicit. Well, anyway, yeah. The gist, though, is that if that devotee continues to practice sincerely, and as we know, Srila Sridhar Maharaj says sincerity is invincible. If they practice sincerely and try to actually work to correct the faults, acknowledge the faults and work to correct the faults, then their progress isn't going to be impeded. So when someone does seem to go off the rails, we can still consider them a devotee, but we don't have to follow them. When things went awry here in Hawaii back in 1973, Srila Prabhupada said a couple of different things. Once he said it was the fault of that all the responsibility was on the leaders who had left, but he also said that the devotees should have been discerning enough to not follow them, because after all, many of the devotees have been practicing for a few years. So it's not, Prabhupada says, it doesn't excuse persistent bad behavior by a devotee. So, if we can accept correction, and keep trying even harder, just like when you make a mistake practicing the cello, you make a mistake, you don't make a big deal out of it. I remember when I was taking piano lessons, and even before that accordion, when I was taking piano lessons, a couple of my teachers would use a metronome in the lessons, and they said, well, when you make a mistake, don't go back to the beginning of the bar, because the metronome does. Just keep playing. And they said, that's what you need to do when you're in a performance. You just keep playing. You realize, oh, I made a mistake. Same thing with meditation. You're told not to think, just concentrate on your breath. But if a thought does come into your mind, you don't make a big deal out of it. You don't beat yourself up over it. You just think, oh, okay, there's a thought. And then you go back to your breath. So the devotee, when they realize they've made a mistake, then they should go back to their practice, perhaps even more assiduously, when they realize, oh, maybe I'm not as far along as I thought I was, or this was a mistake that maybe caused a disruption, and maybe I need to make an adjustment in how I deal with others. So, so Srila Prabhupada says this verse is not there to excuse that kind of persistent bad behavior. That help, Annapurna? Oh, yes, she said it was a question. She forgot this question mark. Is there anything else? Okay, then I guess we can adjourn here, and with gratitude, I will see you all back here again the same time, same place next week. Thank you all so much. Hare Krishna.
Bhakti Abhay Ashram Maharaj ki jai.
Hare Krishna.